On a frozen January night in 1977, the divided city of Berlin seemed to breathe through its concrete seams. Steam rising from manholes, headlights slicing through the mist, Stasi patrols drifting like phantoms along the wall. It was a city where every footstep echoed across borders, where every shadow belonged to someone who shouldn't exist, and where silence itself often carried encrypted messages. Inside a dim bar on Oranienburger Straße, a man who called himself Volkov sat alone at a corner table. No alcohol, no cigarettes, no wasted movement. His coat was damp from melting snow, but his posture remained crisp, almost brittle, as if every muscle were calibrated for decisions that required absolute precision. He wasn't here to meet anyone, at least not officially, but someone was watching him. Every intelligence service in Berlin kept a list of ghosts operatives who moved between east and west without leaving footprints. Men whose files contained more redactions than words. Volkov was one of those ghosts, though none of the agencies could agree on who he truly served. Some claimed KGB, others whispered GRU, some thought he was an independent contractor for Moscow Center, and a few, very few, suspected he played a deeper game. What no one knew was that tonight, Volkov was making a choice that would fracture that secret life. A waitress passed, and he lifted his glass just enough to catch the reflection behind him. A tall man had entered, American build, too clean-cut, the kind of face that belonged in embassy corridors rather than Berlin's underground bars. Volkov did not look directly at him. He didn't need to. The coat was CIA issue, the shoes, American, the gait, military past. The bait had arrived. The American Casey Monroe, a mid-level CIA case officer, took the stool beside him without permission. Neither spoke for a long moment. The bar's jazz vinyl crackled between them like an old radio transmission. Outside, a streetcar clattered past, drowning the second handoff signal. Monroe finally murmured, "The package you requested. We brought it." Volkov did not respond. Instead, he whispered a single sentence in Russian, quiet enough to seem like a prayer, loud enough for Monroe to hear. "Do you know what happens to the man who betrays his own masters?" Monroe didn't flinch. A slow smile, thin and dangerous, cut across Volkov's face. Not approval, amusement. Someone at CIA thought they were recruiting him. Someone believed he could be turned with cash, passports, or a promise of freedom. They didn't understand. Volkov wasn't here to defect. He was here to choose a side in a war no one had written down, a war that required one man to dance between two superpowers until one of them finally broke. And tonight, for reasons unknown to anyone in the room, he had decided it would be the Soviet Union. But no one, not even the CIA, understood what kind of monster they were about to unleash. The jazz record kept spinning, but the rhythm in Volkov's head was older, measured in surveillance intervals, in the timing of doorways, in the invisible geometry of a room where every angle could become evidence. He let Monroe sit in the discomfort without offering a rescue, watching the American's hands more than his face, watching what he touched and what he refused to touch, watching for the tiny tells of a man trained to lie with his whole body. Monroe slid a plain matchbook across the table, the kind bars gave away for free. No writing, no numbers, just a cheap logo and a strip of paper that looked unimportant enough to survive a search. Volkov didn't pick it up. He reached into his coat and produced a coin, an East German 2-mark piece, and rolled it across the table with a lazy flick, letting it drift until it struck the matchbook and stopped. Only then did he take the coin, pocket it, and leave the matchbook where it was, untouched, as if contact itself could contaminate it. "Too eager," he murmured. Monroe's mouth tightened. "We can do this somewhere else." Volkov finally looked at him, and the warmth in his eyes was the kind that never belonged to kindness. If you move the meeting, you admit fear. Fear creates patterns. Patterns get people buried. But why? He stood, placed exact change on the table, and walked out without waiting to see if Monroe followed, because a professional never followed when he was supposed to. Outside, Berlin hit him like a cold slap. Snow had crusted along the curb. A street lamp buzzed with a dying filament. Across the street, a parked Trabant sat too clean for the neighborhood, its windows fogged as if someone had been breathing inside for a long time. Volkov didn't acknowledge it. He didn't need to. He turned left, then right again. An old surveillance detection route, not frantic, just. In the reflection of a blackened storefront, he caught a second tail well-trained, not Stasi. CIA had come layered. Good. At the next corner, he stopped at a public phone booth and lifted the receiver without dialing. The line hissed. He listened, then hung up. Not a call. A test. The hiss was clean, no tapping, no parallel click. He kept walking until he reached a narrow side street, where a delivery truck blocked the view from the main road. He stepped behind it, bent as if tying his shoe, and slipped something into the slush behind the rear tire. A small plastic sleeve, sealed tight, the kind a man would use for an object that couldn't afford moisture. Then he walked away. Monroe did not pick it up. Not immediately. He passed it twice, like a man who didn't see it, then returned, knelt, as if checking the tread of his boot, and palmed it so smoothly it might as well have vanished into air. Inside the sleeve was not money. It was a single strip of thin photographic film, microfilm, showing a diagram of a relay layout and a set of time windows stamped in Cyrillic. The kind of schedule that belonged to a communications chain. Not a casual spy, a map of how Moscow listened. And beneath it, typed in English with the calm precision of a man signing his own death warrant. If you want me, you don't buy me. You build me a lie big enough to kill my own side with. Monroe didn't read the microfilm under a lamp or a magnifier in some clean, safe apartment. He read it the way men read poison, with the understanding that the act itself could already be part of the trap. He carried it across 3 sectors of Berlin, changing trams twice, stepping off once just to step back on, letting the city's noise smear his trail until even his own instincts began to doubt what was real. Only then did he enter a narrow walk-up above a bakery whose ovens never cooled, where a CIA technician waited behind blackout curtains with a viewer no larger than a paperback. The strip revealed its cruelty in inches. Relay nodes, handoff points, alternate windows, contingency bursts, an elegant skeleton of a Soviet communications apparatus threaded through Berlin's bones. Not just listening posts, but timings. When an agent would be expected to be visible, when he could vanish, when a dead drop would be safe, because another operation would be making noise elsewhere. It was a blueprint for invisibility, and it was signed, in its own way, by the same arrogance. Volkov had included a flaw. A single timing overlapped 6 minutes, where 2 of his network's protocols contradicted each other. A seam you could pull if you knew where to pinch. The technician tapped the overlap with a pencil. "This is either a mistake," he said, "or a handshake." Monroe stared at the tiny numbers until they felt like a pulse. "Or he wants us to chase it." In the corner, a battered radio set sat under a towel, not for show, not for drama, just a reality of the time. It wasn't the kind that sang to the room. It was the kind that listened to bursts so short they could pass as static if you weren't ready. The tech lifted the towel, adjusted a dial. A burst transmission, no words. Just a pattern, frequency, hop, duration, interval, like footsteps in snow. The tech scribbled it down, then looked at Monroe with the flat seriousness of a man who hated miracles. "Someone's illuminating the air," he said, "and they're doing it close." Monroe felt the matchbook's weight in his pocket as if it were a stone. Or someone hunting Volkov. That was the nightmare. If KGB center had grown suspicious, Berlin would become a tightening loop. Stasi checkpoints as pressure, KGB handlers as knives, Western watchers as bait. In that kind of weather, Monroe opened a drawer and removed a thin folder. No stamp, no letterhead, just pages that looked like bureaucracy and smelled like danger. Inside were forged memos, fabricated routing slips, a set of internal notes about a supposed new American collection method aimed at Soviet microwave relays, written in the bland, confident language that made lies feel official. The plan wasn't to convince Volkov. The plan was to convince Moscow. They would feed Volkov information that looked like an American breakthrough, just credible enough to force KGB center to shift assets, reroute couriers, and expose their own geometry, trying to protect what they thought they'd lost. The lie would be a hook buried in paperwork, and Volkov would be the hand that placed it on the line. The technician's voice dropped. "If this works, they'll promote him." Monroe nodded once, feeling his throat go dry. "And if it doesn't?" He didn't say the rest. They'd kill him for treason, and they'd use Berlin to do it in a way that made the body look like weather. They didn't call Volkov. You didn't call a man like that unless you wanted Moscow to know you were desperate. You arranged air around him until he walked into the shape you needed. For 3 nights in a row, a harmless American diplomatic courier, real, not fabricated, took the same route from the Cyrillic compound toward Dahlem. Always at the same hour, always carrying a leather pouch that looked heavier than it was. The pouch contained nothing but old cables and a dead battery pack, chosen precisely because a KGB watcher would assume it was something else. On the 4th night, the courier didn't appear, and in his place, an East German taxi rolled past the same corner twice, slow enough to be noticed, fast enough to seem accidental. A signal sequence, not a message. Monroe watched from the back seat of a parked Opel with the heater off. Across the street, the bakery lights burned like a false sense of warmth. Somewhere on a roofline, maybe 2, someone was doing the same math with binoculars and patience. At 21:17, a short burst hit the air again. The same insect chirp pattern the technician had caught, now shifted half a notch on the band, as if the sender wanted to confirm a receiver had moved. Berlin was full of static, but this wasn't noise. This was discipline. Monroe's driver, a German asset who never asked questions, murmured, "You want to go now?" "No," Monroe said. "We go when he thinks we won't." They had seeded the lie into the bloodstream of the city in the only way that mattered, through people who didn't know they were carrying it. A secretary in a West Berlin ministry received a misfiled routing slip from an American liaison. A British staffer overheard a staged argument about microwave illumination. A French journalist got a tip that sounded like gossip. The Americans had found a way to pull voice off reflected beams without touching a wire. Each fragment was true enough to survive repetition and vague enough to grow teeth. Volkov would not react to the rumor itself. He would react to who reacted to the rumor. At 22:03, he finally appeared not on the street, but as a shadow behind glass in a second-floor window across from the bakery, where an apartment had been dark for months. The curtain moved a fraction, then settled. No silhouette, just the sense of eyes, in a place that shouldn't have eyes. Monroe felt the matchbook again, the stamped address pressing into his palm like a confession. The plan required a meeting, but not a dramatic one. No trench coats, no handoffs, no hello. It required a moment where Volkov could make a choice, while believing he was the only one choosing. Monroe stepped out into the cold, crossed the street as if he belonged to the night, and entered the bakery, just as the ovens sighed, and the bell over the door gave a thin, innocent chime. He ordered nothing. He simply set the matchbook on the counter beside the register, turned it so the gold crest faced outward, and walked back out without looking at the window. Behind him, somewhere in that dead apartment, and the radio band above Berlin went quiet, as if the city itself had stopped breathing to listen. Volkov didn't take the bait the way amateurs did, by rushing toward it. He took it the way masters did, by letting it sit, letting it rot, letting other people touch it first, so the fingerprints in the room wouldn't be his. 2 days passed, then 3. Monroe kept the pattern alive without feeding it. The same courier route resumed once, then broke again. A West Berlin phone booth rang at 2:11 and stopped before the second ring. A dead mailbox on Hohenzollern-Damm gained a fresh scratch near the lock, like someone had tested it with a key they didn't intend to use. Each piece was small enough to dismiss, sharp enough to cut. On the 4th night, Monroe got his answer in the only form Volkov trusted: consequences. A safe apartment in Steglitz went dark at exactly 20. Not the lights, those stayed on. The room went dark. The watchers inside felt it first. The sudden absence of ambient hiss on their receiver. The way their own breathing seemed too loud. Their line to the street had been clean for months. Now it wasn't clean. It was empty. Monroe arrived 10 minutes later, not running, not urgent, just moving with the calm of a man who had already accepted the price. The surveillance chief met him at the door, face tight. "Vanished," the man said. "Our outside team never saw anyone enter, never saw anyone leave." Monroe stepped into the living room and understood immediately what Volkov had done. The couch cushions were shifted back into perfect alignment. The ashtray was empty, though someone smoked there. A glass sat in the sink, rinsed and placed upside down, hospital clean. It wasn't a snatch. It was a message, written in domestic details. Volkov had reached into Monroe's world and removed a single piece without making noise, just to prove he could. On the coffee table, under a newspaper folded with unnecessary precision, lay one object that didn't belong. A child's plastic toy soldier. The kind you'd find in any 5 and dime, painted in a cheap green that had already started to chip. It was positioned facing the front door, rifle raised, like it had been staged for someone walking in to see. Monroe picked it up without gloves, then froze, because the toy wasn't hollow the way it should have been. It had weight, a dense center, engineered, a dead drop disguised as a joke. Inside the base, sealed under a thin layer of melted plastic, was a sliver of film and a strip of numbers, short, brutal, and clear enough even without a key. "You want me. Earn me." Monroe stared at the toy in his palm and felt the trap closing not around Volkov, but around the idea that Volkov could be forced. Berlin didn't reward force. Berlin rewarded patience sharp enough to look like mercy. Monroe didn't take the toy back to Langley. He took it to the only place in Berlin that mattered more than paperwork, an unmarked room behind a medical clinic in Dahlem, where the air always smelled faintly of disinfectant and hot circuitry, and where men with calm hands could turn plastic into truth. The tech peeled the melted seam with a scalpel, lifted the microfilm sliver into a viewer, and the room filled with grainy rectangles that looked like nothing until you stared long enough to see the intention. A street corner drawn in shadows, a tram stop sign, a chalked numeral on a brick seam that wouldn't exist by morning. And beneath it all, 8 digits grouped like a habit, not a code. The strip of numbers wasn't a message. It was an address inside a one-time pad. A page and line call-out that only a professional would risk leaving in the open. Not Moscow, the tech muttered, watching the frames advance. This is field grammar. He's writing to someone who knows the rules. Monroe already knew who that someone was. If Volkov wanted him to earn him, then the payment wasn't money or bravado. It was proof that the CIA could do what Moscow did best, reach into a life without leaving a footprint. So, Monroe built a reach of his own. He didn't try to hunt Volkov. He hunted Volkov's certainty. He tasked a small team to tamper with a channel Volkov trusted more than his eyes, a courier loop that fed the Residentura through East Berlin, under the cover of ordinary municipal routines, meter readers, maintenance crews, the kind of men who carried clipboards and moved through basements without being questioned. One loop, one link, one night. A Stasi liaison owed Monroe a favor that wasn't written down and couldn't be collected twice. Not an arrest too loud, not an interrogation too slow, just a clean administrative stop at a checkpoint where papers were checked, and an innocent-looking envelope was found in the wrong pocket, so the man could be turned around and sent back with shame clinging to him like smoke. Then Monroe added the second blade. A message delivered to Volkov in Volkov's own language. A dead drop appeared near a public phone in Tiergarten, a folded tourist map pinned under the coin return with a sliver of graphite dust smeared along the edge, the kind of mark a janitor would wipe away without thinking. Inside the map was a strip of theater ticket paper, and on it, a sequence of digits matching the toy's format, page, line, word count, an invitation that could only be read by someone who lived with a pad hidden in his walls. The words, once reconstructed in Monroe's head, were simple and merciless. We can see the hand that feeds you. Soon, they will cut it off. If you want to live, stop playing alone. No signature. No threats. Just a door cracked open. 3 hours later, in a West Berlin cafe near Bahnhof Zoo, the radio behind the counter, an old boxy Grundig, made a sound no customer noticed. A tiny, dry flutter in the static, like a breath caught between stations. Monroe's man at the window didn't look up, but his fingers tightened around his coffee cup. Across the street, a pedestrian signal blinked red, then red again, then held an extra second too long before turning green. A reply. Volkov had read the message, and Volkov, for the first time in years, was answering someone who wasn't Moscow. Berlin didn't announce betrayals with gunfire. It announced them with tiny distortions, footsteps that sounded too measured on snow, a car door that shut too softly, a knock that came in, a cadence no neighbor would ever use. Volkov read the directive in real time. Monroe didn't need the words to understand the shape of it. The passive resonator's modulation ripple told him enough. This wasn't new tasking. It was a recall, an extraction order dressed as routine. With a second clause, no one said out loud, "Bring him back," or "remove him." "They were never going to let me retire," Volkov said quietly. "No," Monroe answered. Volkov took the taped one-time pad page he'd sacrificed earlier. Monroe had left it untouched, exactly as promised, and fed it into the boiler flame. The paper curled, blackened, and lifted into ash, like a final chord cut in silence. Outside, the side entrance knock came again. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Volkov didn't flinch. He looked at Monroe with something colder than fear. "Permission. They came to collect me," he murmured. Monroe didn't reach for a gun. He reached for a switch behind the ducting panel, an unglamorous piece of hardware that turned the entire night into a net. Across Berlin, an American-German team shifted positions. Not to burst in, not to stage a heroic arrest, but to follow the collectors back through the routes they thought were invisible. The safe apartments, the cutouts, the courier handoffs, the dead drops that kept a city breathing two different loyalties at once. Volkov moved first, but not toward escape. He walked up the stairs like a man going to greet guests, hands empty, shoulders loose, expression composed into mild irritation, perfect cover. At the top, he opened the door himself. Voices exchanged polite warmth. Names that weren't names. A question that sounded like courtesy and was really a test. Volkov answered with the exact amount of truth a professional could survive. Monroe watched from the shadow line of the basement hall, listening to tone instead of content. No one raised their voice. Then the real operation began, not in the parish hall, but in the city beyond it, where surveillance cars rolled and turned and rolled again, tracking the men who believed they were hunting. By morning, Berlin would look unchanged, but the map underneath it wouldn't be. And if anyone ever asked what happened to the KGB's master spy, the official story would be smaller than the truth, because the cleanest victories were the ones that never needed to be spoken.